Your journey has been an interesting one up to here. You've questioned so much more than those around you. You've even questioned yourself as to how you could have grown into these thoughts. Am I crazy? When did I begin to think differently? Why do people in general appear so limited in their thought process? Rest assured, you are not alone. The world is slowly waking up to what you already know inside, yet can't quite verbalize. Welcome to the Spiritual Dope Podcast, the show that answers the questions you never even knew to ask, but needed the answers to. Questions about you, this world, the people in it. Most importantly, how do I proceed now moving forward? We don't claim to have all the answers, but we sure do love living in the question. Time for another hit of Spiritual Dope with your host, Brandon Henley. Let's get right into today's episode.
Hey there, Spiritual Dope. I'm on with a special guest today. It is Ryan McElvenny. Ryan, did I get that right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So listen, for the people that have been on this podcast for a while and hung out for a while, sometimes I really jack up like the last name or any part of the name, right? And I think one of the things that we learn here is pay attention to your intuition. I was getting ready to start off, and I was like, you know what? Let me ask real quick, right? Let me just make sure. And, Ryan helped me make sure that I said his name correctly. Ryan's got a lot going on, guys. He's, got a background in medicine. He's been in the Buddhist, you were in a monastery for like 4 years. You traveled around the world and you're deep into this breath work. You're still pretty young, I would say, right now at this point in time. I wish I'd found it kind of at your age and had the journey that you did. But why don't you explain to everybody, why you're on and kind of where you're at?
Sure. So for me, just to clarify, it was a tantric ashram. So we were following more yogic and tantric principles and studying.
Oh, other than Buddhism. Gotcha.
Yeah. I spent a little bit of time with Buddhism in Thailand, and then I was in a process of exploring a lot of different things. And I was also in a process of really exploring my own darkness and the depths of my darkness and going into quite a dark period of my life. And that essentially brought me to where I am now, because it kind of broke me down, and I ended up in India and I met this tantric school. I ended up going deep into that, moving to Denmark where they had their second biggest ashram, and then living there, working for that school, studying and practicing very, very intensely, periods where it was 7 hours a day for 7 months while working more than full-time hours. So it was quite an intense life, not necessarily what when I first mentioned that I was in an ashram, a lot of people imagine this very, very relaxing kind of lifestyle. But because we were tantrics and karma yogis, we loved the intensity. And that's what we were cultivating, this capacity to stay centered in intensity. And this is still very much in a way, the core of my entire the way that I live my life and the way that I share these techniques and teachings that I share now. So since leaving that ashram, I came to a point where I felt that what we were being taught in the ashram made more sense to practice in the world than in the ashram. So Tantra is a philosophy that's very much something to be practiced in the world rather than in isolation. And so I left and I started teaching the techniques that I'm still practicing, that I learned the foundations of there and have continued to develop. And I was teaching one-on-one for about a year. And about 6 months ago, I started to teach groups these techniques. And around when this should be airing, or maybe a couple of weeks out, I'll be launching a new platform which will go even deeper into some of the techniques that I learned there. And a lot of that is about working with the breath and working with different ancient techniques from the Hatha Yoga tradition, but bringing them kind of up to a more modern standard. So understanding what's actually going on when we're using these techniques, and understanding the mechanics behind them, both on a physical and, we could say, an energetic or spiritual level. So that's kind of what I'm up to these days. Well, right now, honestly, I'm settling into my new home in Mexico, and that's been more of a process than I expected it to be. But once I'm
Sure.
settled, then it's straight back to developing this platform and teaching these techniques, including meditation and breath techniques.
Nah, fantastic. So before we dive into all of it, right? And that's awesome. You've been so deep into this, and again, to the people that are tuning in and listening today, if you haven't checked out, make sure you go check out his Instagram, because he does some really amazing postures and exercises that really kind of blow my mind. Right? I'm like, at the beginning of the beginning of the beginning, and Ryan's definitely further along than I am. He talks about doing 7 hours of meditation in a day for 7 months straight. I might do 7 hours in 7 months, if we're just calling it out, but that doesn't mean that I don't do it and use it. So, I mean, that's pretty intense and awesome. So we're going to dive into all of it. So Ryan, I usually like to start these off with the whole idea, right? That you and I are basically conduits for universal energy, right? You and I are here for really everybody else's highest and best good, right? We're here for service. And somebody listening to this podcast today, they're not gonna hear you and I talking. They're gonna hear a message that's specifically for them, right? And it can only be delivered through you to them on this platform in this moment. What is that message today, Ryan?
Well, I feel that different people will be in different places and take different things from it. But for me, what is one of the core messages that I really try to get across to people is the importance of cultivating a dedicated daily practice, whether that be 5 minutes or 10 minutes, or as it was my case at sometimes 7 hours. And whether it's 5 minutes or 7 hours, it doesn't really matter. It depends on what we want to offer to the practice and what we are kind of aiming for the practice to help us to achieve. But especially for men, this daily aspect to it is very important. This dedication, this fire. And this is one of the things that I always try to encourage people to embrace, because I mean, you kind of mentioned it a little bit before we started recording, but there is so much what I would call the plague of vagueness in modern spirituality. And actually, when we look at yoga, traditional yoga, so yoga now comes to mean just postures, but yoga, asana is one part of yoga. The postures are one part of yoga. And yoga itself is, in fact, a very, very detailed and almost scientific system for spiritual development, for development of the person, like even outside of the spirit, development of the capacity to control the attention, the capacity to move our energy and not be moved by our energy, if that intuitively makes sense to you guys. And when we start to practice daily, we start to see the impacts that it can have for us. And there's a number of, I can elaborate on that quite a bit, but I don't want to jump ahead and jump too much into that.
Nah, thank you, and I think that's awesome, right? Like you said, absolutely. There's a vagueness, right, and it can be a little maddening, because like, let's have a conversation, but let's also land the plane, right? And understand and come to an understanding of what that looks like. And when you talk about, hey, yoga, like you said, is been westernized, right? We see something happening, and we see the outside effects of it, and we're like, oh, we want that, and we do all the outside exercises stuff and feel like that's it, right? Yeah. But really, as you're saying, as you're talking, like there's a greater depth to this, and the development isn't just your glutes, right? Your development isn't just so you look good in yoga pants. It's like there's a whole inner work. As a matter of fact, all of it it just should kind of boils down to like this inner work and this inner process, this inner knowing and development that hopefully I think is growing, right? I feel like that awareness is growing at this point in time. What's your thought there?
Yeah, I definitely feel it is. I feel that we're at almost a tipping point in terms of the way that the collective subconscious and the way that the collective consciousness is expanding. And I feel that people are definitely like, and the other thing is that honestly, even when I first started teaching, I never used the word yoga. I never used the word tantra, because I don't necessarily want people to associate these transformative techniques with their prior held notions about what yoga is. And so I feel that, you know, whether it's how popular mindfulness meditation is becoming, or meditation in general, you know, asana is one thing. Now we got Wim Hof was really spearheading the breathwork movement, and now we're getting more and more breath practitioners who are realizing what a powerful tool for transformation that is. We don't need to call it yoga for it to be a powerful tool, you know? And it doesn't need to necessarily have exactly the same overall goal as the yogis had, which was liberation. Because what is liberation? It's the removal of all of the programs that we've had put into our subconscious. And this is, once we are free from that, we're free, right? And that's kind of what we're faced with, and what we're more and more, I feel more and more people are starting to become aware of how much, in a sense, to say it very directly, and a lot of people get very triggered by these kinds of terms, how much we are automatons conditioned by our previous experiences, rather than being like consciously engaged with the world. We're really engaged with the world through this filter of past experience. And that to me is like the essence of yoga, is removing that filter. And I feel that is becoming more and more popular now, that awareness of those programs, and this desire to at least choose which programs we have, if not to remove them completely, is becoming more and more widespread. And I feel that that's very beautiful. And the thing is that once we realize that that's what we want to cultivate, we can see that the yogic technologies, whether it's, you know, asana is a very useful technology, but even more so when we start getting into working with the breath, when we start getting into one-pointed meditation, these are very, very effective tools for exactly that, for removing our conditioning and then making space for us to choose the way that we want to be in the world. Now, I will add one caveat, that I think that there is always a danger when things start becoming, we can say, like more mainstream, that the essence can get lost. So, for example, mindfulness meditation has become very, very popular. And it's become very popular because it now has clinical trials that support its efficacy in certain realms. And it's been shown to be very, very effective for reducing stress, for harmonizing the nervous system, for reducing reactivity and allowing us more space to choose the way that we want to engage with the world. The trouble with that is that for the yogis, for example, and even for the Buddhists, mindfulness meditation was not an end in itself. It is a intermediary phase towards a higher state of meditation, where we really enter this, you know, states of silence, which have fallen a little bit out of vogue because they are quite, you know, the learning curve to access them is quite high. And so we've kind of settled for the intermediary stage. The danger is that when Go ahead.
Well, I mean, so let's pause there for a second, right? You got a lot in there, and it's awesome. It's all like, you know, stuff that I agree with and subscribe to, so that's why it's awesome. and that's not, and I'm not looking for an echo chamber though, right? It's like, okay, you know, you've gone and you've lived, like you've lived this, right? And you're currently living it, which is great. And if you don't mind, do you mind if I give a little blurb on like the how you before times before you started doing the breath work and the other stuff that's on your site, right? Like, I mean, you get, and I bring it up because, plant medicine and hallucinogenics and psychedelics are a big part of this, all this right now, right? This mental health space. I went through it too, right? And the reason I bring it up too is that I want to touch on the idea that the work that you're doing and the breath work and this yogic work and the stuff that you can do on your own is almost more intense, cleaner and better in a sense, right? Like I think of kind of like like LSD or hallucinogens are almost pale in comparison to the reality of what you can create through this breath work and some of the other stuff, right? And some of the takeaways and connections that you can establish that are long term versus when the trip wears off, you're like, well, that's over and that sucks, right? Because now you've got this thing that you've created and you've got a sustainable connection that doesn't require you. Go ahead.
If I can interrupt one moment. Even more dangerous when it wears off and we don't even realize it's worn off and we think we're still there.
Right.
So we're acting like we're still there, but it's not showing up in how we engage with the world. This is something that I've really, what I would say is that there's a difference between experience and integration. And we live in a society now that is far more, I would even say, obsessed with the experience. We want to have the intense experience. We think that the experience itself will transform us. But there's no space given to the importance of integration. Without integrating the experience fully, as you said, it wears off. It doesn't really make the deep transformations that we're longing for. And we hold on to this, like this somehow mental idea or this memory of the experience as if that transformed us. But it really, most of the time, it's not the experience itself that's transforming to us, it's the integration. And so these tools, what I feel is that psychedelics are an incredibly, incredibly powerful tool to be shown things. So we see a lot when I still, since during my time in the ashram, these kinds of things were strictly forbidden. Since leaving, I feel, firstly, I let go of the dogmas that were there, and I want to engage with everything consciously rather than reject some things and prioritize others. And so for me, I enjoy very much psilocybin and mushrooms in recent times. But what I've noticed is that these are very powerful tools for seeing certain things, but then it's my daily spiritual practice, or my practice of breath and meditation, my transformational practices, which allow me to integrate the lessons from what I've seen so that I can actually change the way that I engage with the world. Does that make sense?
No, I mean, absolutely, right? I think that it's like you're saying, we've got this propensity to chase the experience, right? Or even hold on, like you said, hold on to the memory of the experience, even with the breath work, right? I mean, we can have this intense, powerful breath work experience, and the next time we go in, we're like, I want what I just had last time, right? And to that end, Ryan, since we're talking about it, right? And again, the conversation about the removal of the filters, right? Talk about that all the time, right? I love the idea too that you're saying, let's remove yoga, let's remove any other language that directly identifies this as like yoga or something else, because that makes it accessible to everybody. So, because if you say, hey, this is a yogic practice, somebody's like, well, I tried yoga once and that's just not for me. Right. Because they've got this memory again, and they've created a filter to that. Right. So you remove some of those filters so that they can, remove all the filters, or like you said, consciously engage and like say, hey, you know what? this is the model that I had before. This is the program that I'd been using previously. I recognize this now as the program. What program do I want to run now? Right? Like, for a while, Ryan, you were running the Ashram program. Now you're running this other program, right? So like, consciously saying, all right, this is the new program, right? This is the old program. It worked for a little while. It got bloated. I changed a couple pieces of code, and we're going to run this new program and see how that goes. But doing it at a conscious level, like you're talking about, and being fully aware of how you feel in this moment and whether or not that's in alignment with the truth of who you are.
Yeah, indeed. And when we are really able to connect to how we feel in each moment, programs become much less necessary. And then you can really... So one thing that I've really noticed, and I'm going to talk more generally about personal development, is that the trend in personal development is the introduction of new programs to sit on top of the old programs. So if you have somebody that's very shy, one of the examples I use, and I'm not necessarily criticizing or judging this, but if you have a man who's very shy, he might go out and learn game so that he gets confident to go out and speak to women. He introduces a new program on top of the shyness. But he doesn't really do anything to heal that wound that's inside that's causing that set of circumstances.
Sure.
It's a new program, and the programs tend to compete against each other. And sometimes one is the dominant program, and other times the other is the dominant program. But the biggest problem with this is that when we introduce new programs, we are introducing the program that we believe is most beneficial to us from the place of the mind. So it might not even be the case. And even if it is the case that is the program that's best for us, it's best in this circumstance, in this moment. If that same man enters into a long-term relationship after those experiences, he now has his shyness to contend to in terms of dealing with his lover, and he now has all of these essentially quite objectifying programs which he's introduced when it comes to dealing with his lover. It's not so harmonious for that new situation.
Right.
So it's a little bit out there, but for me then, the best thing from my perspective is not to focus on the introduction of new programs, but to focus on the removal of programs and the connecting to how I feel in each moment, being aware of my inner processes in each moment so that I can come from a place that's genuine, that's not programmed, that's spontaneous, that's fresh and responsive to reality rather than reactive to my past experiences or my I don't want to say program too much, but programmed beliefs.
Sure. So, I mean, your current beliefs, right, is kind of how you would just say, these are my current beliefs, and how do I take a look at my current beliefs and determine whether or not they're still good for me, right? And then you've got a process, it sounds like, where you could help me do that. What would that process be for you? Hey there, bringing you a quick interruption of this podcast as I share a trailer of another podcast. This is known as just kind of a podcast trailer exchange of a podcast that you may be interested. Check it out.
My name is Will.
And I'm Karen.
And unlike Mulder and Scully,
we both want to believe.
So we've embarked on a journey of discovery.
We've talked to people deeply entrenched in the spiritual and metaphysical world.
We've thrown ourselves into weird and wonderful experiences. I even joined a coven of witches.
And wait, you joined a coven?
Yep, all in the interest of finding something.
Anything.
That will prove that there's something beyond this physical,
three-dimensional world we all live in.
This is the Skeptic Metaphysicians.
Join us every week as we explore a new corner of this weirdly wonderful universe.
Always keeping a pragmatic eye on the subject. We don't live entirely in the woo.
The woo?
The woo.
What's a woo?
You know, the woo.
That doesn't help me.
The woo-woo, you know.
Oh, the woo-woo. Why didn't you say that?
Pretty sure I did.
Catch us on your favorite podcast platform.
Or across the world on select radio stations.
The Skeptic Metaphysicians.
Your world will never be the same.
And now back to our regularly scheduled program.
Yeah, so I focus very much on these techniques, which, I mean, particularly one technique in particular, which I've called diaphragm hacking, which is based in a very, very, considered to be a very high yogic technology. And it's kind of, I don't use the original yogic name for two reasons. The first one, because it can be alienating to people who don't care about Sanskrit, but also because that technique, that name has been attributed to a technique which is not really on the same level. It's as you said, it's a very superficial understanding of that ancient technique. And what this does is, it does a couple of things, but in terms of what we're talking about right now, it has a almost direct capacity to interface with and unwrite programs. So I'm a completely different person than I was 6 years ago when I started to practice this technique. 6 years ago, I was somebody who was completely controlled by my desires and addictions. I was addicted to weed. I was an alcoholic. I was very addicted to pornography and addicted to sex. And I was very, very angry all the time. And this was a very heavy program for me to start to unwrite. And one of the main tools has been going into essentially, like, when we work with the breath, we're interfacing directly with the nervous system. The breath is known in yoga and now in kind of modern terms as the gateway between the conscious and the subconscious, because it's the only one, to take it to modern terms, it is the only one of our autonomic nervous functions, so the functions of the nervous system which happen automatically without our conscious, us putting our hand on it consciously. It's the only one that we can start to control without too much prior training. You need a little bit of training, but anybody can sit down, and if you tell them, okay, slow down your breath, they can start to try to slow down their breath. They have that capacity. And this means that it's this gateway between what we call the somatic nervous system, the functions that we have direct control over, and the autonomic nervous system, the functions that we have that we normally don't have control of. And through interfacing into the nervous system this way, we can start to essentially rewire it, to unwrite those pathways. Because, again, I don't want to get too technical, but I'm just going to make another relation between ancient yogic science and modern science, modern behavioral science, is that in yogic science we have what's called samskaras. People often talk about karma. It's a very misunderstood concept, and it's very, very, it's a very high concept is the thing when you actually get into it. But what I feel is more relatable is the one of samskaras, which are referred to as these grooves. So samskara literally means this groove, and it's this idea that every time we have a thought, every time we do an action, we scrape a groove a little bit deeper. And that means that it's easier for the knife, we can say, to fall into that path and follow it again each time. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I mean, look, it's like for anybody that's ever held a record, right? Like, I mean, it's the same thing, right? You've got this, you've got the needle that's going to keep staying in that track until it's disrupted, right? So yeah, absolutely. Makes sense. I love that. I love the imagery. Go ahead.
And our behaviors in terms of the yogic science are the results of the grooves that we've built up, either in this life or in the yogic idea in past lives also, but we'll keep it a bit more relatable and just say in this life we we start to be taught certain behaviors from a very young age. We start to have certain thought patterns from a very young age. And every time we have that thought, every time we do that action, it gets a bit deeper, meaning that we're even more likely to do that thought or action. And so and this has been shown very much now with modern behavioral science in terms of the way that we form habits. So we know now that the more that we do a certain action, the more likely we are to pick that up as a habit and to start doing it with ease or with less difficulty or even unconsciously. Right. And I like to use the imagery of a path in a forest. If you're walking through a forest, you can see the path where there's been people who have walked beforehand. It doesn't have growth on it, so it's easy for the feet to follow. Sure. Now, if we want to change our behavior, there's going to be a need for a conscious effort to choose a new path through the forest, which isn't so easy to follow. So we're going to need to have a landmark, for example. So say at the big tree, the path goes to the left of the big tree. And we're going to say, you know what, I'm going to start going to the right of the big tree. But every time we're not conscious, we're going to go down that left path. We're not going to go down the right path. It's going to be a conscious effort to keep going down that right path until we start to go down it enough times that we start to cut a new path through the forest and the old path starts to grow over. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I love it, right? And it's just like you're saying. I mean, this is applicable like anywhere. If you're driving home and you've got a certain road that you always take, right? Exactly. You stay on that road, right? Even though there's plenty of other ways home, you have to consciously make an effort to be like, you know what, I want to go a different direction today. I want to see something different, right?
Go ahead, sir.
And see, to one of the other things you mentioned, like past lives before too, and while that might seem for a lot of people to be like, oh, I don't know about past lives, man. Let's take this example then. If you don't believe in past lives and you're one of those people that says, you know, all these things matter and I believe in science, then let's use a little bit of science, right? It's definitely been proven that traits pass through at least like 7 generations, right? So the programming that we are born with is, maybe we can't and won't call it our past lives, but I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, you know, we've just barely begun to know how to read DNA. There's more encoded in that than we know yet, right? So what's in there could be past lives, records of past lives, right? And the way that you act and react has been scientifically proven to be passed on to you from your ancestors. So you can call it past lives, you can call it something else. But the truth of the matter is the way you act and react has definitely been programmed into you, and you, through what Ryan's talking about here, have the capability, like Ryan's saying, you know, and Ryan, you can, you know, jump in anywhere, but like, you know, as you interface directly with the nervous system, and you can begin to flip the switches of your genes through this practice. So I just wanted to, I wanted to highlight that, because you're not off the mark by saying, you know, when you talk about removing the filters, right? And this is why I went back to that. So, you know, if somebody's got a thing about a hang up on past lives, then they may not have a hang up with the science, right? But to me, they're ultimately saying the same thing.
Exactly. And this is the thing, is that the amount to which, like, as I said, when we really get into yoga, it's really a lot more scientific than we realize. There's very little vagueness to traditional yoga. If you read the original Hatha Yoga manuals, they really read a lot more like an instruction booklet than some kind of very vague and woo-woo new age spirituality thing. And right. At the end of the day, whether we believe in past, like, you know, it's also just a form of describing certain phenomena, like you're saying, even outside of genes, like even if we don't get into genes, just the very fact that your grandparents raised your parents in a particular way, and then your parents raised you in a particular way, is already writing these, neurons into certain pathways that are easier to fire down. And that's exactly the same as the path in the forest. When neurons are used, they get easier to fire down. And when neurons are not used, they get less receptive to the electrical signals that create our behavior. And so we can even just talk about past lives in terms of, well, my parents' parents, my parents' parents, as you said, and the way that they inscribe certain behaviors or thought patterns into us. And when we start to use these techniques, and not only these techniques, but in my experience, these techniques are, one-pointed meditation and yogic breath work and these kinds of things. They are particularly effective ways to interface with these patterns.
Right. Let me jump in there, Rico. One-pointed meditation. How's that different from Headspace, for example, or is Headspace an example of one-pointed meditation?
No, Headspace is very much an example of this Buddhist mindfulness, which is really an intermediary step in a deeper meditation practice.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So one-pointed meditation is very, it's almost, the name describes itself. We affix the attention to one point, and then it might run away. We bring it back to that one point. And we just train more and more to be able to keep the attention on one point. And then this leads to very, very incredible effects, because when I'm going to go a little bit into detail here, but essentially we have this, one of the great things about mindfulness is that it starts to make us aware that we are not the mind. We start to become able to observe the movements of the mind and realize that the movements of the mind and the thoughts are separate from our attention and our being, which is a very, very important step, because in our society, especially the Western society, we are so deeply identified with the mind. We even have philosophers in the Western tradition saying, I think, therefore I am. And it's not true. We are, and the thoughts are an observable phenomena from the place of our true self, which is the observer. And
they're part of the experience, right? Like they're part of the experience that we ascribe to ourselves. We're like, it'd be like me jumping in the water in a bathtub and saying I'm the bathtub.
Exactly. And then when somebody comes in and stirs up the water, you start to freak out because you've put your hand in me and you're stirring me up. It's not the case. We can take the step back and we can observe. Oh wait, those are my thoughts, and I'm watching them. So I am something else. Yeah. And so that is a very important step, and it's very good that mindfulness has become popular, so that more people start to realize that there is something more to their identity than the mental movements. Mm-hmm.
Right.
But what one-pointed meditation does is that through affixing the attention firmly to one point for long enough, the movements of the mind stop. And then we discover that stillness, that silence that used to be associated with meditation. I remember when I was a child, that's what meditation meant. And then that was kind of quite a high goal that people felt a bit intimidated to embark upon. And so this new definition of meditation showed up, which was just basically sitting and listening to music or listening to a guided thing. But meditation is very much this state where the mind stops. And one-pointed meditation, go ahead.
Well, I mean, so what I'm hearing you say, though, is that mindfulness is kind of where most people are at this point in time, and yet we're calling it meditation. Is that what you're saying?
Well, we're calling lots of things meditation. We're calling essentially any activity where we maybe introduce a bit of awareness, maybe even not. Maybe we're just listening to music. We have affixed this label of meditation to it. And it's a little bit problematic to do so, not because these practices or these actions don't have value. They do, and I'm not denigrating their value.
Right. No, yeah, I just want to make sure. Yeah. I want to clarify, right? So if we're, if I like purity as much as the next person, right? Like I'm not going to call butter and margarine the same thing. That's just I cook a lot, right? So, yeah.
And that's a great example, because if we just start calling margarine butter, then it gets to the point where nobody knows what butter is anymore.
Yeah, nobody wants to get to that state.
But this is what's happened with a lot of these things, with meditation, for example. Nobody thinks about what meditation originally meant anymore.
Right.
And even is aware that there's a next step beyond what's become quite popular in the form of mindfulness, or in the form of these, visualizations and all of these relaxation practices. They're very valuable, but they're a different thing. And it's sad to see butter become extinct. Because
no, for sure. But here's what I'm really enjoying about this conversation is to let's reintroduce the distinctions. Right. Let's come back to it. Let's say, hey, listen, this is great. It's not that you've been doing anything wrong, and it's not that you're doing the wrong thing. But let's understand, and let's be clear that your mindfulness practice is not meditation. There is something beyond, and this is, I'm glad you're bringing this up, because I wasn't familiar with this distinction prior to it, because and my experience has been like, all right, these mindfulness practices and Headspace. Wonderful. Helped a ton, right? What took me to the next level was
started, brother.
Yeah, help me a ton. What took me to the next level was breath work. And finding even just moments of stillness in that space. I could be totally wrong. I'm going through the Tibetan Book of the Living and Dying right now and talking about Bardo states, right? And for me, that space, that just that little space of stillness is for me like a Bardo state, a transition in between like all the crazy and just this for a minute.
Yeah.
Right. And so to me, that's what I tell the group. I'm like, listen, if you've tried meditation, if you tried mindfulness, and your mind's still fucking crazy, that's because there is absolutely something else to it. And I tell people that when we do this breath work, when we go into this Bardo state, when we go into like, a retention or something like that, that to me is what meditation is supposed to be. Am I missing the mark, or am I close?
No, I feel like you're dead on, brother. And this is actually the thing that I say to a lot of people when we speak about this, because for me, the one-pointed meditation is very important. The diaphragm hacking, which is a form of breath holding, with a few different added things to it, but its foundation is a breath hold in a void, so in an empty lung state. And this is exactly what I say to people, is that one-pointed meditation is great if you're really doing it. And even myself, after 6 years of practice, the majority of time that I'm meditating, I'm sitting and I'm waiting for that meditation. Or I'm aiming to get to that meditation, but I'm not necessarily there. And the trouble with this is that it's, to speak very frankly, it's a practice which we can bullshit ourselves into believing that we're doing. I can sit here and I can say, I just meditated for an hour. I'm so good. But I maybe, if I'm lucky, meditated for a couple of minutes of that hour that I was sitting.
Yeah.
When we start to get into breath holds, you cannot bullshit it. You are either there or you're not. And if you're not there, because you need to take a breath almost immediately and entering the breath. If you're really there, you can hold for 1 minute, 1 minute and a half, 2 minutes. You can hold these what's called bandhas in the yogic tradition and still hold the breath for multiple minutes. And then
Are you talking about energy locks? Like energy locks? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so they're quite misunderstood, so I hesitate to use that word, but exactly.
I got it. what is like? All right, man. We just met. I never done breath work before. Totally interested in everything that you're talking about. What's the first thing you're going to tell me to do?
Yeah, so I'm a big fan of and it's very popular anyway, square breathing. Square breathing is a fantastic technique. It's based on a yogic technique called Samavriti Pranayama. And the fascinating thing with square breathing, from a couple of levels. Firstly, it's very, very harmonizing to the nervous system. So you are automatically starting to bring the nervous system into a state of equilibrium just by doing a little bit of square breathing. It's an incredibly simple technique to do, but it can be very, very powerful because the majority of us exist in a state of constant nervous system excitation, and it brings it back down. But the other great thing about it is that it's already starting to train what we can call CO2 tolerance, which is becoming more and more talked about and more popular in the current times. And this is a very, very good indicator of our capacity to deal with stress. So if you don't mind if I go on a little bit of a tangent about CO2.
Go for it, man. Absolutely.
We have at the base of our brainstem, essentially, what's called the chemoreceptors of CO2. And this is telling us, or this is sensing what the partial pressure or the concentration of CO2 is in the blood. And CO2 has been a very, very misunderstood molecule because it's been seen previously as just a waste product of the rest of cellular metabolism, essentially, of the workings of the body. But more and more, it's being acknowledged to be a very, very important molecule for the function of everything. It dilates the vasculature, which allows for blood to more easily travel into all parts of the body, including the brain. It's also necessary for oxygen to detach from the hemoglobin and actually enter into the tissues. So the more CO2 we have, the more efficient we can get oxygen into the tissues.
Ron, real quick, is it more CO2 or the right balance of CO2?
Well, this is an interesting question, and I don't have a complete answer to that because it hasn't really been looked at in so what I'll say is that from my perspective, I am not sure if I can get enough CO2. I'm very curious because my entire my practice has been so focused on these breath holds, so focused on increasing my CO2 tolerance. And now my natural respiration rate, it sits at about 5 to 7 respirations per minute. That's when I'm just checking it out.
And that's just like you not and for somebody that doesn't understand what that is, I believe that's about around 5 seconds in, 5 seconds out, if I was counting, right? Breaths.
Yeah,
roughly.
That would end up being 6. So yeah, exactly. Around that,
right,
sometimes a little lower even.
Yeah.
And
so for I think that somebody, for the listener, right, try that out for yourself to see what Ryan's regular breath work, breathing, that's your regular breathing. I consciously have to do that, right? And I think that's pretty cool. I just wanted to call that out. Go ahead.
Well, the fascinating thing with that is that, so from, as you mentioned, I have a background. I was a registered nurse. My first rotation was actually, ironically, in the respiratory ward. And when we look at that, in terms of modern science and modern medicine, that would be considered a dangerously low respiration rate. If somebody had that respiration rate on the ward, you would start to worry about that person.
Right.
And it should have certain symptoms like sluggishness or like the incapacity to really engage and these kinds of things. But I definitely don't feel like that, And when it comes to recently, I was a very avid jiu-jitsu competitor many years ago before I started on this path. And recently I revisited that. And the coach was amazed at the way that I don't seem to get tired. And I'm not fit at all. I'm not strong. I'm not athletic. But what I noticed after he was commenting on it so much, I was just becoming aware that even with a guy 20 kilos heavier than me on top of me, my breath was still very calm, very slow.
Right.
And he was the one breathing like,
yeah.
And so for me, I'm not sure. And, you know, I don't want to make a conclusive statement, but for me, I'm not sure that I can get enough CO2 in the system. It's just about increasing that tolerance and increasing the amount of CO2 gradually. And I'm definitely more centered, more relaxed, more still than I ever have been. When people hear that I used to have anger problems, they kind of can't believe it, because that's not the way that I come off now. And
that's great.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I love it. Right. I mean, I think you and I can go on for a long time. Unfortunately, we're kind of towards the tail end. So I want to make sure that you also hit on. You said you've got a new course coming out, right? A new platform to get ready to release. What's that going to be, and what can people expect to find there from you?
Yeah. So just to give a little bit of background, 6 months ago, I started to do 5-week trainings in the diaphragm hacking technique, and it was wonderful. It was a wonderful experience, and it needs 5 weeks because it is a little bit more of an advanced technique, and so I like to build it up level by level so that people really get strong results from it. But what I noticed was some of the participants were getting very, very amazing results from the technique, and other participants were getting results, but not to the level that I would like it to be. What I realized the difference is this kind of foundation that they have. So the ones who tended to have better results were people who were already meditation practitioners, either Vipassana or mindfulness or something else, or ones who were already like really into Wim Hof or really into yoga. So they had that foundation already. And so what I decided to do, and the other thing is that I noticed that after the 5 weeks was over, many of the people would slow down or stop practicing. And without, you know, I was in an ashram for 4 years. I had that support to my practice.
Right. Yeah.
So what I really wanted to do was to solve both of those problems. So now I'm launching a new platform, which will be more of like building an ongoing community so that people are supported in continuing to develop their practice. And also the program itself is being extended to a quite intensive 3 months, and people can take it at their own speed, so they can take it over longer than 3 months, which really lays the foundation. So they start to get an awareness of their body, get an awareness of their breath, get an awareness of what's going on with their mind, learn to relax before having the more powerful but more difficult techniques taught to them. And I'm hoping, and I've done this with my one-on-one clients, and it's been quite effective. I'm hoping this allows everybody who comes to the platform to be able to build that foundation so that when they learn the more powerful techniques, they can really get the full results from it. They can really start to interface with the subconscious and remove whatever heavy programmings are controlling them. So we're going foundations. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so you're I think on your site, it's like, you know, if you don't mind, like, you know, part of what you're talking about is, you know, focus and freedom from like anxieties and addictions, but also sounds like there's some benefits to the sport practitioner.
This is the trouble that I've had with learning to market these tools, is because I feel that if I was just upfront with how profoundly impacting they have been for me and my students so far, I would sound like a snake oil salesman. I've had to focus in on certain what's called pain points in the industry, which I don't necessarily love to do, but it's part of the game. But really, these techniques are so effective for somebody, whether they're dealing with anxiety or addiction, or whether they just want to level up to be the next capacity in focus, in presence, especially presence, in unwriting programs in, opening up to be more engaged with their reality and achieve even more and be more in line with their purpose and their dreams. And this is really what we're aiming for.
100%. I love it, man. Well, listen, when I talk about breath work, I talk about it as I'm pretty sure it really is the silver bullet, right? It fixes so many things and it addresses so many things. I'm glad to hear, look, I mean, it's a challenge to quote unquote market it when really all you want to do is share honestly and truthfully, like all the greatness that it can do for anybody. Right. You've got to pick and choose, though, kind of who those anybodies are as you get yourself up and running. For the people that are tuning in, guys, Ryan's no joke. If you're, serious about breath work and you've had enough of mine, I get it. That's cool. Even if you still hang out with me, I won't be jealous if I spot you hanging out with Ryan and checking out his breath work because, he's going to offer you something that I simply at this point in my lifetime cannot offer you. And so check out Ryan. Ryan, where can they go check you out, bud?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram. That's where I'm the most active, at Transformational Ryan. And I'm sure that there'll be some link with this. And I have a website, ryanmcelvenny.com. It's less, I'm less on top of that. I'm mainly on Instagram these days. So that's the best place to find me.
Fantastic, Ryan. Hey, man, thank you so much for stopping in today. I know you just came from Costa Rica. You're over in Mexico. You've been very busy, so I appreciate you making the time to be on today.
No, brother, I appreciate so much the invitation and the amazing conversation. Thank you so much, Brent.
Absolutely.
Really hope you enjoyed this episode of the Spiritual Dope Podcast. Stay connected with us directly through spiritualdope.co. You can also join the discussion on Facebook, Spiritual Dope, and Instagram at spiritual_dope. If you would like to speak with us, send us an email through brandon@spiritualdope.co. And as always, thank you for cultivating your mindset and creating a better reality. This concludes the most thought-provoking part of your day. Don't forget to like and subscribe to stay fully up to date. Until next time, be kind to yourself and trust your intuition.